I was kind of interested in that world of online kind of amateur sex work. And really, I guess that sense of people filming themselves and making themselves available to viewing. And I was very conscious that I wanted those scenes to be as unerotic as possible, to be quite kind of stage managed, or to be quite kind of like, oh no, if I go there, then you put your head there, then you won't see you on camera and things like that. Because my experience of kind of seeing that kind of online content has always been that they're never not aware that they're being filmed because they're filming themselves. They're never lost in the moment. They're always kind of glancing at the camera phone to check they're still in shot, or they're kind of angling their bodies just so they look right. And it's incredibly, to me, unerotic experience, but also this fascinating thing of the different ways.
Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. I've got the Canongate book bag up there, as you can see, because I'm going to be talking to a wonderful Canongate author over the next hour or so. We are going to be talking about fiction, and we are going to be talking about poetry, for he is a very distinguished poet who has made the move into fiction. This is a new novel that was out this month. It is February 2024. Loved the novel. It is, if you haven't guessed, it's Andrew McMillan, and I'm going to invite him now to join me in the book bag. Hello, Andrew.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Yeah, really good, thanks. How are you?
I'm excellent, thank you very much. So we are talking about this book, your lovely debut with Canongate. What a fabulous cover. I love the cover.
It's a gorgeous cover. So,
isn't it just?
John Gray, an artist, John Gray, made it as it's like a screen print that they did, a kind of lino screen print of it. And I had no idea what the sort of cover for this book could possibly be, and then it was just one of those things where they suddenly showed me that and it made sense.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I always wonder how much input authors have. I think very little. I mean, if you were to say, oh God, I hate it, they'd probably just go, stuff it, Andrew, we like it.
Yeah, I did have a very funny conversation with the editor where he said, he sort of sent it to me while I was at work, and so I hadn't replied to the email, and sort of after an hour he called me and went, look, we all really like it. We've all had a big meeting, and we all really, it's okay if you don't like it, but we all really like it. But luckily I did really like it, so it was fine. But you've also got to trust, it goes through, it has to go through so many different levels, I think, with fiction for very different kind of reasons. But I was really pleased with what we ended up with, and to keep it classic, to not have any kind of print, only the kind of name of the book and the name of the novel, as it were, on the front, rather than any kind of endorsements or anything, and kind of just have the image, I think, has been a really nice thing.
Yeah, I mean, all the endorsements are on the back, and what endorsements they are. You have Douglas Stewart, John McGregor, Max Poulter, Sean Hewitt. Like there's some amazing people who have stepped up and said that they think this novel is absolutely amazing, which it is, of course. I mean, talking about the not exactly collaborative nature, but as you say, a lot of people have input. Has that been different from your poetry?
Yeah, well, so with my poetry, I've always been really lucky that so my poetry is Jonathan Cape, and so it's Robin Robertson who edits that. And so I've always been very lucky that I've had a poet editor and a really hands-on editor who has kind of really gone line by line, word by word with me, and kind of wrestled with the intricacies of the poetry. So I was used to being really closely edited. I think the big difference for me with fiction was just the size and scope of what editing means when you're writing a book of fiction. So, you get to a point with poetry where, an entire poem maybe just needs putting to one side for a while, or the ending's not quite working, or I've said that bit before in a different way, so I need to work on that stanza. Whereas like with a novel, sort of the entire architecture of time in this novel doesn't work. So dismantle the entirety of it and try and rebuild it again in a different way. And so somehow, yeah, it's that kind of the size of it that was new to me, the scope of what needed to be done to edit a novel, I think. and also just to be very, very new at something again. And so to be a novice at something again, and just eager to learn in that way, I think.
It's quite pared down. It's very pared down. Is that because it's written that way, or you found yourself cutting more and more? Or, I mean, what was the kind of architecture to begin with, and how did you start? Did you just kind of launch in and listen to the voices and write and see what you had, or was it sort of carefully constructed from the start?
So for years, I tried to write a kind of version of this novel that was in the style of the stuff that I've been reading. So I would tend to read a lot of just very traditional literary fiction. If I was picking fiction up from like a bookshop, if I was going on holiday, that's what I would read. And I couldn't, it just seemed natural to me that what I enjoyed reading would be the stuff that influenced what I wrote. And so for a long time, I kept trying to write it in that kind of omniscient third person voice. And there were a lot of messy, quite long drafts of it like that. And it just felt like I couldn't do that voice sincerely. And I couldn't work out why. I found that incredibly frustrating. So I kept thinking to myself, but this is what I enjoy reading. And so why is it not coming out in this way? And so a large part of the battle for me was, as you say, kind of trying to work out those different voices, or work out just how to tell it in many ways. And it was a colleague at work who showed me, she's an ethnographer by trade, and showed me some field notes that she'd written about Barnsley when she'd been doing some work there. And I suddenly thought, oh, that's one of the voices. I can get that voice, and that could be one of them. But that sort of pared back style in my poetry and in this novel is just what I've always been attracted to. That's just aesthetically what I am drawn towards. And John McGregor, you mentioned, is one of those people who really kindly endorsed it on the back and the blurb and things like that. His style of writing, the kind of austere aesthetic of what he writes, and particularly the kind of early novels, I think, were just real permission givers to me, both in my prose and my poetry. Like, that's always been the kind of heaviest hand on what I write. And so, it's a very short novel. It's maybe 32 or 33,000 words, and it was never longer than that. It went through a lot of different changes, mainly to the timeline of it, in order to kind of build in tension, or to make the different sections kind of tessellate together. But there was never a kind of baroque 80,000 word version of it that got kind of hacked down. It was always that that kind of plainness and slightly pared and very pared back style, just because that is, as I say, aesthetically what I'm drawn to, I think.
Okay, so let's say what it's about, which is always, I mean, poets don't like that either, do they? What are your poems about? The form is the content is the form, and all of that. But it is the 40th anniversary this year of the miners' strike. So let's start with that, because that's that runs through and influences the characters, but it's not a book about the miners' strike per se. It's
not, and nobody would believe that the fact it's landed on this anniversary is accidental, because it's just a quirk of when I wrote it and handed it in, the process of years that it takes to kind of get something kind of sold and then kind of out onto the market. But yeah, we get three generations of the same family. So we've got what I've come to think of as the kind of granddad generation, and we see a kind of just the methodical working of getting up, going down to the pit, kind of doing that work. A couple of scenes in the allotment for that kind of the fresh air and the freedom that gave the men that were working down the pit. And then we get that character's sons. So we get Alex and Brian. We meet them first as children, but we mainly encounter them kind of in middle age. They both worked down the pit. They both lived through the strike. Brian, the elder of the two brothers, has, I guess in my mind, fared better post kind of strike and post the pits closing. He's kind of landed on his feet a little bit better. Alex is struggling in many different ways and for many different reasons, and we kind of see glimpses of that through the novel. And then we meet also Alex's son Simon, who I guess is really the heart of the novel. And he's doing what a lot of kind of guys in the mid-20s have to do in Barnsley, which is kind of build a career and a life out of different things. So he's working in one of the massive call centres that replaced kind of the heavy industry in places like Barnsley. He's doing weekend drag shows in Sheffield for what he describes as for students and hen parties. And then he's also doing online OnlyFans sex work as well. And he's really the kind of heart, I guess, of the novel, and his on-off relationship with Ryan, who works as a security guard at the local shopping centre. And so they're really, I guess, the kind of Russian nesting dolls of the same family that we really encounter in Barnsley. And then we just got these visiting academics as well, who are both running workshops and trying to do work around the 50th anniversary of a pit explosion that happened in Barnsley, but also writing these field notes and kind of doing much more, I guess, kind of socio-political observation of the town as well. And they kind of punctuate through the novel.
And isn't there a sense with the field note sections that Brian, much to his bemusement, is sort of taken in and interviewed? But it seemed to me that you're a little bit skeptical of the value, or they're coming in. To what extent are they really able to understand this community, and how valuable is what they're doing? Did you have some skepticism towards that sort of field work, or is it a bit more ambiguous than that?
I think a bit of healthy skepticism is good. I've done that kind of work as an academic, and when it's good, it's very good. And I think there is a real value in that kind of co-produced kind of academic inquiry into spaces. And what I didn't want was that kind of real binary of like, oh, the bad academics are coming, but the salt of the earth people of the town will show them what's really true and things like that. And I think it is slightly more ambiguous in that what I was really interested in, I think, is what happens when kind of intellectual idealism meets reality. And so, one of the academics espouses something that I would espouse to the ends of the earth, which is that it doesn't matter how you spell something or how you write or what your grammar structure is or any of that, but actually everything's equally valid. And he kind of makes that point, the academic makes that point in a workshop, and one of the people goes, yeah, but we still need to get jobs. And both those things can be true, that how you speak shouldn't matter, but it does in certain circumstances, in certain places. And how do we kind of hold those two truths at the same time? And in another example that's kind of mashed together of two different things, because I didn't want to be sued by the artists in question, but it kind of imagines some artists who'd gone into a school in Barnsley and decided that it shouldn't have any walls, and that there would be no classroom, that it wouldn't have any walls, that there'd be no staff room, that it would kind of be built as one egalitarian space. Some schools, new schools in Barnsley, were built like that, and I'd gone into some of them. And again, I understand the utopian ideal of where that comes from, but it's an idea dreamt up by people who've never taught kids, and certainly not kids in towns like that. And so again, I'm kind of just interested in, I guess, what happens when those two worlds kind of collide, I guess, to a certain extent. And, in many ways, I am the academic outsider coming back to the town and kind of looking and bringing my own kind of mistakes and things like that to it. And on a really practical level, I think for a novelist or for a novel, what they allow is to take certainly the field note aspect, this slightly more bird's eye view of the town, and to talk about some of those socio-political contexts of why Barnsley is the way it is, what's kind of happened to it. No two people in a successful novel could sit down in a cafe and go, do you know, we live in the lowest paid place in the country? And someone else goes, oh, do we? That's interesting, because that reminds me of the socio-political context that we're born into. And so in order to do that, you kind of need a different device to kind of pull at some of those threads. And the field notes became a way of, I guess, interrogating that as well. So there is some skepticism in there. And I think they're both kind of sides of it are skeptical of each other. And they come towards some sort of understanding and move towards each other throughout the novel. But it certainly, hopefully, isn't a kind of a binary of good and bad. It's just what happens when different world views or world experiences collide, I think.
Just hearing you say that made me think of this morning. I went through London Bridge Station, which has been comprehensively rebuilt over the last few years. And I thought, as I nearly always think, this was built by somebody who never ever gets on a train and was never going to use this station. everything's in the wrong place. You always have to walk a mile. It seems to have been moved half a kilometre from the underground. The escalators are in the wrong place. You're always in the wrong bit of the train. It's unbelievably hopeless. And I just think the people who came up with this, the old station was shabby, but it kind of...
But it worked.
It worked. If you were at the front of the train, you just went straight down and then you were in the tube. And now it's like, no, I have to go in the opposite direction and then come back. But anyway, what you said just reminded me of that. This kind of, people who are never going to use something are the people who build it. I might be wrong, person who designed London Bridge Station. Maybe you use it all the time and you love it, but I'm not loving it. So I can't remember from reading the book, is Barnsley specifically mentioned? I thought it might be a kind of, a northern former mining town. But
the characters in the novel quite a bit. And then the academics tend to just refer to the town as a kind of slightly more kind of outside way. But certainly the characters are very certain of kind of naming it as Barnsley.
Oh yes, there's a reference to, and I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong. I would say Wombwell, but there is a... What is it? How is it?
I would say it's almost like it's WUM, so Wombwell.
Wombwell, right? Okay, and that's the kind of thing as well. How people signify who they are and where they're from the way they... I think it's the train again. Trains again, isn't it? A train up.
Train announcement, and it was always just a kind of running joke with us when we were younger as well, because I think they've changed it now. I think they've got I think they're trying to do more regional accents where the trains are based, but it was always somebody kind of over pronouncing, as you say, Wombwell, and that's always kind of struck as odd, and just each kind of town village along the way back to Barnsley would always be kind of pronounced in this very kind of RP way, which seemed kind of at odds with these kind of little old pit villagers that you're kind of moving through on the train.
Exactly. Now, I mean, going back to the miners' strike. Well, you weren't even born, were you?
Well, I was born in 1988.
Were you born? Oh no, you weren't.
Oh yeah, so 88 I was born. So it's kind of just out of living memory for me.
So, but was it something that you were very aware of growing up? Something that people still spoke about? I mean, the book is very much about, the long haunting, and the academics talk about this, don't they?
Yes, it's this idea of that comes kind of from Avery Gordon, from Jeff Bright, who's another brilliant academic, that kind of talk about this idea of a social haunting, which is basically after any place has endured a kind of social violence, that it lingers into future generations. And I think one of the really interesting things in places like Barnsley, in some places in the Northeast, is that, it's outside of my living memory, but there are people also 10 or 15 years younger than me who will still get very, very het up and emotional about the role of the police at that time, or the role of Thatcher at that time, or and it is obviously kind of passed down through anecdote, through kind of local history, but it's also something beyond that. It's something kind of beyond the tangible, where it feels as though that kind of anger is somehow inherited, I guess, through it. And that's one of the things that the novel's really trying to wrestle with, this: what is it for a town to be kind of haunted by its own past, whilst trying constantly to move beyond it and kind of move on as well. And it kind of wrestles with its own kind of ideas of what that means, I think.
And Simon, a rather wonderful character, and like you say, the sort of heart of the book in many ways. I mean, he couldn't be more modern in the sense of him doing this kind of online sex work.
Yeah.
I mean, is that something that you think, I know, I'll make him do this, or was it always part of the schema from the get-go?
So 20 years ago, when I was at I'm not going to go through every year since 20 years ago, but 1995, no, but 20 years ago, I did a play at Barnsley College called "'Tis Pity She's a Whore," which is this great John Ford play about incest, basically about brother and sister who fall in love, and it's just really a philosophical treatise on the nature of love. And so 20 years ago, I thought, what would it be to write a contemporary version of that play that was set in Barnsley? And that's kind of the original kind of seeds of the novel in many ways. It's changed utterly since then. It's become something else. But Simon's drag name, Pitana, comes from one of the characters in that play. And she's the kind of bawdy maid of that play, and also kind of just really foregrounds the kind of sex, which is why I want, and the kind of sexuality in that play, which is why I wanted it to be his drag name. But I think with the OnlyFans, I was kind of interested in that world of online kind of amateur sex work. And really, I guess that sense of people filming themselves and making themselves available to viewing. And I was very conscious that I wanted those scenes to be as unerotic as possible, to be quite kind of stage managed, or to be quite kind of like, oh no, if I go there, then you put your head there, then you won't see you on camera and things like that. Because my experience of kind of seeing that kind of online content has always been that they're never not aware that they're being filmed because they're filming themselves. They're never lost in the moment. They're always, kind of glancing at the camera phone to check they're still in shot, or they're kind of angling their bodies just so they look right. And it's incredibly, to me, unerotic experience, but also this fascinating thing of the different ways that they're viewed. And so it was never meant to be a kind of easy nod to something, I guess, just to make it purely contemporary, but just another way of thinking about those ideas of visibility, I guess, and what's kind of hidden and what's seen and things like that. And
also shame. I mean, the older characters have shame about their bodies, and I guess I'm talking about Alex. And there is something refreshing about and Ryan as well. He's not very certain to begin with, and it seems to me that there is something about there's something joyous about those scenes. I mean, like you say, unerotic, but there's something very, I don't want to say sex positive. That's sort of the wrong idea, but good for Simon. I thought good for him, good for you, lad.
And scenes without judgment. I do really hope, and I think, I mean, shame's interesting because if I hadn't decided that all my books were going to begin with the letter P for no real reason other than it's fun, shame could be like another name for this novel in some ways, like, because that's one of the threads that really runs through it. And pity, to me, in that kind of Yorkshire kind of colloquial way, almost is a synonym for shame, because you'd use it in a similar way, like, oh, it's a pity that happened, it's a shame that happened. So they sit very closely together in that kind of dialect, I guess. And Alex, as you say, is wrestling with different desires that he has that he is quite ashamed of, or just doesn't quite know where to put. And with him, the thing for me was I really didn't want him to be the kind of cliche in a novel that would be kind of, well, no son of mine's going to do that. Do you go and get a proper job? Like he struggles with Simon's kind of drag work for different reasons, but he goes to see a show. The phrase I've ended up landing on is like, he's not unproud of it. It's a struggle for him, but he's not unproud. And Ryan, similarly, like Ryan works as security guard in the Alhambra. He wants to be in the police, which is not an uncontroversial thing still to want to do in that part of the world for certain families. And one of the really interesting things, I guess, I was interested in is their point of the point of tension between Simon and Ryan is when Simon wants to leave some of his drag makeup on to leave a show and kind of walk into the world kind of almost half as his drag persona and half as Simon. And Ryan can't deal with that. For him, it's kind of either full kind of drag and that's safe and over there, or you kind of Simon in the world as a kind of guy, and he can't handle that kind of in-between space when Simon just leaves some of his face makeup on. And so again, this internalized shame maybe, or just internalized homophobia that he's kind of trying to work through with Simon kind of as they're just living their life, I guess.
What's that film about the lad who wants to be a dancer, and it has this sort of father go, no son of mine is ever gonna do ballet.
Billy Elliot, right? But gorgeous.
That's it. Billy Elliot, yeah.
Makes me weep every time I see it.
Oh,
In that they go on that, like, because in that he goes on that real journey, right? And then by the end they kind of go down and see him and things like that. Yeah, I love that film. But no, it's that, and I think that's just often either the story that we've been given or the assumption that people make about places like Barnsley, that they would be kind of violently homophobic places, whereas actually, I mean, they can be sometimes, and it's complex because Simon's drag is certainly more accepted than if he tried to come out on the football team, because these things are kind of the ways that masculinity is coded in certain places is different, and so it's kind of complex. But these towns aren't the cliches that sometimes people imagine them to be, which is why I kind of liked the nuances of, playing with the nuances of how they all kind of related to each other, I guess.
I think drag was always very popular in the North, however we choose to see that. But it was, a great form of entertainment that people, really quite surprising people would go and enjoy. Surprising guys would go.
And there were really interesting kind of things to, that the novel doesn't explore because it's not a kind of thesis. But I think there were really interesting things around something being so other than the norm that it becomes safe again somehow, that it's so outside of the kind of center of something that it's okay to kind of like that, in the same way that it, certain late night TV hosts or kind of chat show hosts are really popular in a way that kind of and again, I always come back to that thing of, but it would be maybe harder on the football team, or maybe harder in some of these manual jobs kind of come out, and that's just to do with the way that masculinity is kind of coded in those kind of places. And also, on the other side of that, one of the things that the OnlyFans scenes also explore a little bit is this very strange kind of adoption or fetishization of what we might think of as like young male working class kind of attire or identity into kind of sexual fantasy, which kind of Simon and Ryan are sort of playing with in their OnlyFans scenes, which is also something about taking something that might be seen as threatening and making it non-threatening by kind of pulling it into a kind of fetish space somehow. And so all these kind of fascinating layers of it, I think, in towns like that, that a novel can only ever really kind of glance at, I guess, because it's not a kind of work of academic theory.
There are passages, these are the passages in Itals that sort of, they're interleaved throughout the story, about the men going to work, going to the pit. And I suppose we would characterize them, if you like, as the most poetic bits of prose. But there's a lovely detail, is that as they're all trudging to work, there's always somebody who falls behind or somebody who has to stop. It's just a touching little snapshot. So those passages, did you kind of write them all at once and put them in, or
yeah, which is probably not the right way to do it, is it? But all these kind of different voices of the novel, I wrote each section of them all the way through once I'd worked out what they'd be. So like all the academic field notes, then all the poetry bits, then all the kind of drag bits, and then went back and tried to tessellate it back together, which I don't think is probably a good way to do it. That bit then became more complex. But yeah, with those italicized bits, they are the most kind of lyrical, the most poetic. And the thing I was really interested in with those is both paying real attention to the kind of minutiae of the physicality of the work of the kind of brutality of it, and finding a way, the kind of paradox of it, to try and find a way to write about it beautifully, potentially, but not in a way that was nostalgic. Because I think one of the really interesting things about, again, towns like Barnsley or thinking about the pits and things like that, is that there's like a nostalgia or a yearning for what it was thought that work brought to places, which was like steady jobs and stable incomes and good money, right? Eventually, because of the kind of industrial action, wages that you could raise a family on, a sense of community. But nobody ever would say, "Oh, I want my son to go down the pit," I want my kids to do the same work, because it was brutal work and it was horrible work that nobody would want anybody to kind of have to do. And so there's a kind of odd kind of paradox between those two things that don't sit kind of neatly side by side. And so, yeah, so I was interested in, could you write about it beautifully without romanticizing it? Or could you write about it lyrically without looking at it through rose-tinted glasses, I guess? And that was the challenge of, for me, or what I was interested in those pieces. And also just the day-to-day rhythm of it. So the fact that the kind of cyclical nature of it, the rhythm of it, lends itself much more to poetry than it does to kind of more naturalistic prose, I guess.
Would you like to read something from Pity?
Yeah,
so we get a flavour. That'd be lovely.
I should probably read a little bit of those kind of italicized parts, I think, just to kind of give us a flavour of it. So I'll do the first couple of those. So we kind of meet them all first. And I'm saying them because the kind of central character of it's not named, but we meet them all first going down to the pit and then kind of getting into the cage as well. Let's clear my throat. I've done so many events this month that my voice is sounding hoarse.
Yeah, you're majorly on tour, aren't you? You're launching this all over the place.
It's always been like one of my pet hates when writers say they're on tour, because it always makes them sound like they're trying to be too glamorous. But having done about kind of 17 events now in about 20 days, it's almost, it's not quite, I still won't bring myself to say it's a tour, but it's almost one. So here we go. He steps out into the long corridor of early dawn, the street stretching downwards, pointing him to where he's headed. It's Monday, and the weekend is still unshaven stubble in his mind. Above, the sky is a solid lump of cloud, and 3 doors down, Pat is just closing his front door. Another few doors on, there'll be Harry, and then Frank. And as they all turn the corner together, Skip will already be ahead of them, and each of them will briefly consider running after him, and then think better of it. Nobody speaks. They incline their heads as someone else joins them and then keep on walking. More and more men fall out of their houses, like dominoes, their faces not yet blackened. Someone whistles, someone else coughs. Occasionally some stop and lean for a moment on the low wall of a garden, pretending they need to double-check their snap tin or enjoy a long drag on their roll-up, sputtering the smoke out into the cold air in shallow breaths. Nobody waits for them. They just keep on walking. The village on their shoulder now, still asleep, not watching the migration of tired bodies. One of the men once said he thought he could hear the coal ticking. Another man told him to stop talking daft. And beneath their feet, a mile down, history, waiting to be hacked into chunks and pulled out. The cage is what he hates most, crowded together into a space no bigger than a front porch. The expanse of the weekend closing, being so cramped and close up, descending and smelling the other men, their Sundays and their lack of sleep, and their wives and their children and last night's supper. He'd shower after his shift and hadn't washed at home, and so the night still hangs heavy on him. Watching the earth pull up around him through the bars, he feels like an animal travelling beneath the wooden beams, the lights, and then coming to a stop, and a man stepping forward like a school teacher to a gate to open up and let them through. Each time it takes his eyes a while to adjust to the new darkness, like waking up all over again. And then they walk, headlamps pointing the way into the tunnels, and there isn't much talking, something like a gathering of breath, readying for the black wall they eventually meet, which never seems to recede no matter the hours they put in with their tools. At least out of the lift, he's free to move his limbs, to swing and to pick and to break. Sometimes he feels like a germ, dismantling something from the inside out. Sometimes the noise of the belts and the drills is so loud, it's as if you can hear the gears of the earth turning and turning.
Did you interview miners, ex-miners, for those passages and other passages?
No, so it was done through just through reading, just through kind of watching archive footage of it, and then really just kind of giving it over to thought and to kind of feeling and just trying to map it out that way. There were certain things I was really keen to kind of get right in terms of fact checking. So in terms of like some of the mechanics of like, oh, when did they stop using the kind of belt, or would they be using this kind of thing? So certain bits like that I really wanted to get right, and then the rest of it just to give up to poetry, really.
When I was looking at your original collections, your poems, I came across, I made a note somewhere. Yeah, this is in physical. This is your debut poetry collection. You probably know what I'm going to say, but one of the poems ends, "Pits close, we still sink into them."
Yeah.
Which, you know, Oaks Lane Pithead is mentioned as well. So it does feel like it's been there. But does that mean you were writing the novel or thinking about the novel even when you were putting your first collection together, and that came out in 2015? Is it as long ago as that?
Now. I mean, I think that, so Pits Close, we still sink into them, is actually as well, Brian in the novel ends up writing that in the poetry workshop, because I really didn't want to pay anyone else any permission money. So I thought if I use my own work, it would be free. And then it turned out I still had to pay myself in some sort of weird money laundering escapade through the rights.
You have to pay Cape, maybe.
And they'll pay me back, and so it's all fine. It's like a weird kind of tax. But anyway, no, I think what I've always been, Barnsley and that post-industrial heritage and what it means for that place has always been central to what I've been interested in. And I think, I mean, this novel, out of all three collections of poetry, the novel does sit closest to physical in terms of what it's interested in. And it's in many ways a return to those original ideas of just masculinity, sexuality, and place, and what happens when all those three things are kind of turned together or interact with each other. And just that great metaphor that subsidence as a word throws up, or subsidence, that because of the kind of empty mine shafts and things like that, those kind of towns are literally sinking into their own past as well as metaphorically. And it's always just struck me as a really kind of interesting thing to explore. So that phrase comes up in physical, and then Brian, one of the characters in the novel, gets to write it as a kind of revelation in a poetry workshop, which is run by a poet who may or may not be me, but is almost certainly me in the novel. I was really determined that this wasn't autofiction, because my poetry has always been incredibly personal, and I find it therefore really hard to live with it in the world, or it's always quite an anxiety-provoking thing to kind of publish poems because it feels very exposed. And the great joy of having a novel out has just been, well, I just made it up. It's not true. It's just like made up things. And so I thought, in order for people to know it definitely wasn't about me, a kind of hapless young poet with loads of tattoos kind of walks on at some point and does a kind of slightly kind of awkward poetry workshop in which someone writes that. And so that's my way of having a kind of Alfred Hitchcock little walk-on moment. So that's definitely me. And none of the other characters can do, I guess.
Well, talking about physical, so as I say, it came out in 2015. So I think this must be a fairly early edition that I've got here. Winner of the 2015 Guardian First Book Award. And I remember going to that. That was somewhere on the South Bank, wasn't it? I remember going to the presentation of that. I mean, you won loads of things, didn't you? Let me see. The only poetry collection ever to win the Guardian First Book Award. It also won a Somerset Maugham Award, an Eric Gregory Award, a Northern Writers Award, and the Aldborough First Collection Prize. And it's also been voted as one of the top 25 poetry books of the past 25 years by the Booksellers Association. But when it actually came out and you had no idea any of that was going to happen, because it is, it certainly reads as, but I don't want to say transgressive, but I think this is what people really responded to in it, that it was frank. I mean, you have a poem called Urination in it, for example. I mean, were you kind of thinking, oh my gosh, how are people going to react to this? Or had you been kind of, well, I don't want to say cosseted, but had Robin kind of embraced you so that you could say this stuff?
It's strange. Like, I remember the big fear. I was saying, I did a reading for the novel in Oxford a few days ago, and a poet called Alan Buckley, who I know, came to that. And I said, I remember being in a pub with him a few months before this came out, so like early 2015, and saying to him, look, my biggest fear is that no one's going to read this. That's what terrified me at that time. Now that would seem like a dream, right? Because it feels so exposing. But at that time, I was like, what if it comes out and nobody notices? And what if it comes out and it just kind of disappears, which happens to a lot of deserving work, right? That it just doesn't get read. And so everything that happened from that, I think the reason I was able to write that freely was because I imagined nobody would read it. And there was a sense that I didn't imagine that it would have that kind of readership, or out of everything I published, it's still the thing that's got the biggest, the kind of largest recognition, I guess, in that way, which was because of that Guardian Prize. Because suddenly it was read by people who wouldn't normally read poetry. And then everything else kind of snowballed from there in some ways. But it meant that I didn't imagine I was exposing myself to people, that not many people might read it, or certainly what had never imagined what actually transpired, which was that then people felt it gave them permission to share things back with me, and that people would tell me things that they would never tell me if they just sat next to me on the bus, that they felt like it kind of opened a door of kind of intimacy to them, I guess. But it's the book that has allowed me to do everything else that I've been able to go on and do. And it's one of those interesting things, I think, that, I mean, who knows what else I'm going to go on to write or what I'm going to go on to do, but it feels like the book that also will still be the loudest as I move through all my career. And that's a really good thing, but it's a really interesting kind of arc to a career somehow as well, I think.
How long a span were those poems written in? Published 2015, but what does the earliest one date back to?
So the big long poem in the middle, I wrote in 2012, sort of 2012, 2013. It came out as a pamphlet in 2013. And so really kind of the 2-year span just before that, so sort of 2013 to 2015, because I'd sort of floundered around for a long time. I did a first pamphlet in 2009, so when I was in second year of undergraduate, that was like a little poetry pamphlet that was work that was very similar to what ended up being the sort of style I write in, just quite straightforward, quite plain, quite direct, beginning in the self at least, and kind of using the self as the kind of canvas to talk about stuff. And then it came out, and I remember it got this one review, because you always remember the bad reviews, but it got this one review. Why would anyone care about this sort of teenage angst of the self kind of stuff? This isn't what poetry is. Because I was like 19, I thought, oh God, they're right. That isn't what poetry is. It must be something else. And so,
well, that throws Keats out, doesn't it? My goodness.
I took that really to heart, because I just thought, oh, that must be true. And so I wrote a second pamphlet that was much more experimental, like it had play scripts in it, or it had like fake radio dramas in it, and it was very like ironic and playful, and other poets can do that much better than me. That was just never my voice, and it was like me just trying on someone else's clothes and them not fitting right, but it was me trying to do what I looked around and saw was in fashion, I guess, at the time. And then after that, I just thought, no, what am I? The only thing I can do is the thing that I can do, I guess. And so I just went back to that and trusted that even if nobody wanted to pick it up or no one published it, that was just where I was kind of going to be, and that's what I was going to write. And all the poems in physical, like Urination, comes up as a poem that a lot of people remember from that book, and other ones like The Men Are Weeping in the Gin. Nobody
Where's
published
the Badger one.
the
Badger one. Oh yeah, that is in physical.
Badger is incidental.
Yeah.
Like nobody published those poems. They were in no magazines. They got rejected by everybody. But I just kept going, no, that's fine. This is just all I can kind of do. And I just really trusted that that's what I wanted the work to be. And that's what I always try and now tell students, that like, don't try and chase don't look around you and think, oh, it's got to be that because that's what's in vogue at the minute. You're the person who has to live with it on your shelf the longest. And you've just got to trust in what you want to write, I think.
Who are influences on your poetry? I mean, when you were starting out, I mean, I'm imagining Tom Gunn because he's referenced a couple of times.
Yeah, Tom Gunn was the big one. So when I came out at 16 to my parents, my dad came into my bedroom that night and gave me a copy of Tom Gunn's collected poems and said, I think you should read this. And from that, which is a ridiculous story, but true. And then from that moment, I just fell in love with Tom Gunn, not because I thought that it was a life I wanted or could have, because he was off in San Francisco at that time and kind of and in fact, had died just before I started reading him, in fact. But, was writing about San Francisco, writing about America. But it was the first time that I had seen gay life in literature. And it was published by Faber, and it was kind of held up as kind of great poetry, great literature. So that life potentially can be written about. The first person who turned me back onto poetry, because obviously Dad's a poet, and so I grew up in a house of contemporary poetry where the shelves looked like this. They were just kind of full of Carcanet books and Blood Axe books and all that kind of stuff. And then for the longest time, I ran away from it because I think whatever your parents do is just mortifyingly embarrassing when you're a teenager, isn't it? And you just want to do whatever the opposite of that is. And so I wanted to be a politician for a long time and things like that. And then I went to Barnsley College and we did Philip Larkin, who I know for very good reason is kind of deeply problematic and unfashionable now. But there was something in his work which was just unafraid of the power of poetry and unafraid of epiphany that I was so drawn to at that age, that what will survive of us is love, that this kind of reaching out towards something. And it's just the power that he has over phrase, I was really, really drawn to. And that's kind of so he was a really early influence. And then oftentimes it was Americans. And so the mash of my style that ended up in physical is really it's Mark Doty, Sharon Olds. It's this great book of underground British beat poetry called The Children of Albion, which is just remarkable. And that in many ways is where the style of no punctuation and kind of the breath space and things like that really comes out of that anthology. And then people like Thalia Myers as well, I was really drawn to. And I think this is what, again, I always try and tell my students, that we get people who read, when I was just obsessively reading Tom Gunn, I was just writing bad Tom Gunn poems and in imitation. And some critics might say I still do, but I try not to. But somehow having read Tom Gunn, but then Sharon Olds, but then this Children of Albion anthology, but then Thalia Myers, somehow all that combined ended up coming out as something like physical. And I've always thought that if physical had come out in the States, if I was an American poet, it wouldn't have done what it was able to do here at that time, because in many ways America was just kind of 10 years ahead in terms of what young poets were doing or what young poets were able to do. And so it was somehow because it had an American influence, but put through like a Northern English subject, that I think is what at that particular moment, and it just hit a particular moment, was able to, do what it did and have its moment. I got so drunk at that Guardian party. I'd never been to anything like that, and we were both, me and Robin, was like, well, we're not going to win, so we'll just go for like the fun. And so it was just like downing the free drinks out of nerves and things like that. And then they'd sort of lined up the announcement on Twitter before they'd announced it in the room accidentally. It sort of got announced on Twitter 30 seconds before they said it in the room. And so my phone just started vibrating. Like, God, you've won. And then I was like, and then so I had to stagger to the stage and do kind of terrible acceptance speech. But yeah, the trophy's still up there somewhere in the corner. Yeah, look there it is.
Right, yeah. It was a good night. I remember. It was a very good night. So what about Ted Hughes? Do you have to kind of duck from the mighty influence of Ted Hughes as a Northern poet, or did he just not come into what you were doing at all? I mean, obviously Simon Armitage is enthralled to Ted Hughes, or was.
And I've never been able to tune in that much to the frequency of Ted Hughes for some reason. His poetry, a lot of his poetry I find very beautiful, but I was always much more drawn to, say, like birthday letters is the space where because that's just where my poetry ends up naturally kind of being situated. When I was first kind of writing, maybe after university, sort of when I was 22, 23, I stayed in his house in Mythenroyd for a couple of weeks and sort of did a mini writer's residency, and they've kind of done a beautiful thing with the house he was born in, and they're just kind of odd portraits of him everywhere. And so, like, the laureate portrait of him when he was poet laureate just looks at you when you sat on the toilet. And there's like the writing desk. There's a writing desk in the top floor where that very famous picture of like Auden, Stephen Spender, Ted Hughes, they're all just kind of looking down at the writing desk. It's incredibly intimidating. But yeah, Hughes I could just never tune into in the same way that I did with Tom Gunn, and they were kind of partnered together quite a lot in their early days, particularly. But yeah, I just never quite found what other people like Simon found in Hughes, I don't think. And my dad as well. My dad loves Ted Hughes, but he just never quite landed for me in that way.
We should say at this point, your daddy Ian McMillan, he's a bit of a Mr. Poetry, really, isn't he? I was at the South Bank for the T.S. Eliot Prize readings that he has emceed for many years. He's absolutely hilarious. I mean, he was so funny and so witty, but he's I thought it was funny when you said when you were a kid you sort of embarrassed by your parents, sort of, oh, Dad, he's on the verb. He's a very big personality.
Yeah, and it's like that. Like he's like the thing to say about him. He is that nice. Like it's not an act.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, it's interesting because growing up with it, my memory of when I was very young was that he would be out before we woke up and back after we'd gone to bed, because he was kind of doing that freelance life. He'd be in a school in Wolverhampton, then he'd be in a youth club down in Kent, and then he'd be working with prisoners somewhere and just doing that kind of community artwork in many ways before the verb stuff and before the kind of media stuff got kind of bigger. But what it really showed was that, it's possible. Writers are alive. We never had a house where no writers ever came to the house or kind of stayed, or nobody came to dinner or anything like that. Like, so it wasn't that kind of house, and almost deliberately set up where work was out there, but home was something else, and home was kind of home. And but just to know that it was possible to earn a living doing that writers were alive and that they made their living doing that kind of work, I think, was what was really important. And the thing that got instilled into all of us, that of course he still professes, that it wasn't elsewhere. Like, they stayed, and I think it was a conscious choice to stay. I mean, all my family's still in Barnsley. My mum and dad still live in the house I was born in. So, that it doesn't have to be elsewhere, that it can be your street, your voice, your town, your accent, your house is all worthy of writing about. And that was instilled in all of us, kind of growing up from very young. And my two older sisters look at it as something kind of weird and strange and a bit odd, because it is, I guess. And so it's not like we were kind of all raised to deliberately be writers, because they don't have kind of anything to do with this world. But the great permission that it gave, I think, was that it was possible. And I'm aware of kind of the, how big a privilege, I guess, that is. And with New Writing North, where we just started this thing called the Tempest Prize, which is in its first year this year. So it's going to be part of that suite of Northern Writers Awards that I won for Physical years ago. Named Tempest Prize because that's the Tempest Avenue is the street I grew up on in that village in Barnsley. And with the hope of there's some cash on offer. Me and Patience like Barbie are going to judge the first year of it, and mentoring as well. But with the hope of finding stories or poetry or memoir, and not just from the kind of big northern cities, but from places like Barnsley or other places around the region where people haven't had the same kind of chances that I've had to know that world already exists. When I was back in Barnsley the other night doing an event for Pity, and I saw a couple of my old college friends afterwards, and then was waiting for the bus back to mum and dad's. And someone was just talking to me because they recognised me and saying that they live in Goldthorpe, which is like the village next to mine, again, an old kind of pit village. But just saying how much they wanted to write, but didn't feel they had the opportunities and things like that, and that they were going to enter that prize because they felt as though it might potentially kind of offer them that opportunity. For people like that, hopefully that prize kind of offers an opportunity, I guess.
Well, it's like Polari, which you have won in the past, and obviously set up by our mutual friend Paul Burston, and it really brought things about. It's welcomed writers, it's given writers a platform that wasn't particularly there before. Something that
and the explosion
really
of writing, and LGBT plus writing that's happened. Because of what Polari's kind of enabled, both the prizes, but really just the sound, just that play, sharing and kind of gathering, the kind of growth of books and kind of poetry in the last even half decade to decade has been amazing to kind of witness, really.
Well, just thinking about your work, I did look through my own poetry collection, and I found this Tom Gunn, The Man with Night Sweats. I mean, absolutely an incredible collection, but it's still got its review copy slip in it.
Oh, fantastic.
Isn't that amazing? So, publication date 10th of February 1992. Wow. So that's my first edition of this incredible book. And then the other thing I saw that it's rather poignant. It's got he lives in San Francisco. He was still alive. He now teaches half of each year at Berkeley. He lives in San Francisco. Incredible work. So it's wonderful to be part of a continuum.
Yes, and he's having like a little bit of a renaissance. His letters published last year. The first biography is coming out. His first kind of full-length biography that Michael Knox is coming out maybe next year, I think, here, but it's certainly kind of on its way in America as well. Because it's been curiously, compared to, we mentioned Hughes earlier, the amount that's written about Ted Hughes and the amount of books and biographies. There's no full-length biography of Tom Gunn. There's no, there's very little kind of critical engagement with him. And so, the time feels right for Renaissance. In fact, this year it's 20 years since he died. 20-year anniversary of death this year. So hopefully that will bring more people back to the work as well, I think. Yeah.
Well, before we move away from physical, I wondered if you'd like to read something.
I probably should.
Yeah, that would be great.
I'll read, just because this one, I guess we were thinking about moments where physical interacts with Pity and the novel. There's a poem in physical called The Schoolboys, which is kind of set the day after Margaret Thatcher died. And the village just next door to the one that I was born in is the one that was on the national news that day, because people were out in the streets kind of drinking beer and burning Margaret Thatcher in ritual effigy and dressed as miners. And it was interesting because I wondered if that's what people in the South just thought we did every day. And the news crews just happened to wander past on a random Tuesday, and that's what we were doing. But also in the back of its mind, I guess, is section 28 in this poem, and also that great phrase of Margaret Thatcher's, "The lady is not for turning." The schoolboys, coming with the bulge of them through the doors, schoolboys in suits so big it seems as though grown men have deflated inside. Two slump away from the morning rush of bags, phones, arms stretched out of their muscle by the sharp sprints of growth. They find their seats and settle, facing me. First fluff ready for shaving, but left to go feral above the lip. Words sweating into the air between them. The 12-year-old talk that finds the body still comical rather than alluring. They briefly mention Thatcher and the town that came together for a party they didn't understand the point of, although the adults seemed to enjoy it, drinking and setting fire to a doll of her. One makes a joke insult to the other who pretends to be offended, pouting into his rucksack, then out the window. There's silence, but they are still only learning stubbornness and buckle quickly. The insulter takes his friend's face in one hand, pushing his thin lips together to parody the move. The lady by the side of me tucks. The boys let go and start their conversation up again. One puts his hand between the cheap trousers of the other, the way schoolgirls often hold hands on their way to class. The woman coughs and sighs like a slow-punctured football. She stares out the window, maybe thinking of her son, by now a man. She goes red. She focuses on a headline: rising unemployment, lack of manual jobs. The boys move seats. Two others wrestle to impress the girls. The boys sit closer than they need to. The lady burns. I've read that poem for a long time.
So I'm going to skip over the middle collection because I haven't read it, I'm afraid. But I have read Pandemonium, which was your latest. That's 2021.
Yeah.
And again, very in terms of subject matter, it's quite raw. It's very raw. How is it going forward with poetry? Is it getting easier? Is the subject matter kind of changing, taking you in different directions, or how does it work?
So with Pandemonium, it's the one that I found the hardest to have in the world or live within the world. And I think because now when I read physical, it is a little bit exposing, but what I realized in my kind of youth of writing that is that it's all quite broad. It's like, oh, the men, the schoolboys, it's quite kind of broad brushstrokes or something. Playtime is about my own adolescence and my own childhood. And so that was exposing, but only for me. And then Pandemonium was about my then partner. We're separated now, but my then partner, his mental health struggles, me as the kind of role of carer, I guess, and kind of living beside him, as well as my own kind of mental health things as well. And the way that I'd survived those first two books and the kind of public profile that came with them and things like that was to imagine that there were sort of two different selves, that there was a kind of poetry self that could go out into the world and read these poems to people he'd never met and share these secrets and give interviews and be in the world. And there was the kind of home self who is naturally really shy and would rather stay at home and doesn't much like attention, or kind of like doesn't like being in rooms where people look at you and things like that. And And that divide is kind of how I'd kept saying. And then with this book, the artificiality of that divide just kind of came crashing down, because it was about the home. It was about the home life that we'd kind of built deliberately separate from that. So it felt incredibly exposing. I gave Ben entire kind of editorial control. So he went through and changed things, took stuff out, edited bits he wasn't happy with. It was more important to me that he was happy with it than anything else. And so he kind of went through it all before it went off to the publisher and to the editor. And then when it came out, I remember when I got sent the copies of it, just kind of throwing it into a corner and not wanting to look at it, and not being able to touch it for a few months. It felt too raw. It felt too kind of exposing. And it was locked down, so I did a little online launch for it, but I've never really read that much from it or kind of done much with it. But I remember just before it came out saying to Ben, "Oh, but it's like I've written this about you, and isn't that really scary? And what do you think?" And he just went, "Andrew, it's poetry. Nobody's going to stop me in the street." Which is a great kind of comforting phrase. And we're separated now. We're still kind of in each other's lives, but just as friends. And so I then have an even weirder relationship to it, because it's now a kind of historical document of a time that wasn't that pleasant and was very, very difficult, in fact, for both of us. But the poetry is always, I think, that's just kind of how I do it. It's always going to feel quite exposing or quite raw. And so I'm trying to explore ways to write about the breakup in kind of new ways, and write about the kind of dismantling of a house and things like that together. And then the kind of moving on from it. So it feels as though the poetry collections kind of all sit together just in that ongoing process of a life, really. And it was Robin who really early on, after Physical, I don't know why, but I got in my head that it should be something radically different for the second book. So I was like, I must change everything. And I was like, I'm going to write I've talked about this before, but I said at one point I was going to write a series of historical sonnets about women, because I just thought that would be like the opposite of Physical. To me, in my head, that was like the opposite of that. And Robin eventually sort of sat me down and just said, look, the work will change because you will change, but you have your way of looking at the world. And I think that's what's proved to be true, that the work changes because life intervenes and life happens. And so Pandemonium is a much more experimental book, a much kind of weirder book and darker book than the other. And I think some people kind of were wrong-footed by that, or kind of didn't quite know, therefore, where to put it alongside things like Physical. But the work changes because life changes around it, but you have your voice or your sensibility, your way of looking at the world, and that's what stays consistent. And I think hopefully with the poetry, that's what will continue as well.
When you because we're talking about this intersection between writing and relationships.
Yeah.
Do you sort of go, well, actually, I'm a poet. Would you like to read my poems? Or
no, I think it's
you not expect friends and lovers to.
God, no. I deliberately seek out people who have no interest in the literary life, because I just think it's better. Because I think there's a danger that you would begin to believe your own kind of hype, wouldn't you? And like, it was interesting, post kind of breakup with my then partner, I was on kind of dating apps for a little bit, but would sometimes kind of match with people who already knew who I was, because kind of just certain arty gay men of a certain age have like read Physical or like know what it is. And it's just, like, I just found it so strange, because they think they know somebody who isn't you. They know like a performed version of you from a book and not the kind of real you or whatever. But no, I deliberately build a life that's as unliterary and poetic as possible. I think that's healthier.
Okay. Well, I would love you to read something from Pandemonium, and then I'm going to go on to my final 3 questions. So pick a poem. What are you going to...
I'm going to read the final poem of the book, which now, given that we're no longer together, seems maybe possibly more ironic, but also maybe true, right, just in a different way. Descending into the honeycomb cities, I'm returning to the ground already wetted by the transient rains. All the windows of our house are wide open. Climbing the stairs is like reaching my face into the fridge. The bedroom is alive with your breathing, the clattering teeth of the blinds. Outside, the night is perfectly tuned. Slow forcing of the plum trees and their fruit. Buzz of motorbikes on the road. Undressing to land beside you all night. The winds come over us like intermittent water. Ben, I'm not sure what I mean by this, but I'll spend my lifetime coming home to you.
Last poem in the book, and it's part of. They're all sonnets, aren't they? All sonnet form, 14 lines.
Yeah. These knotweed kind of sonnets towards the end of the book.
Yeah. There's something about that 14-line structure that I don't know. It's just the right size. It's just perfect.
I wanted to see if I could do it. I think I wanted to kind of push myself a little bit formally, but also like because I was writing a lot about mental health and the chaos of everything at that time. It needed something to push against that. And so for a long time, I was trying to write about it in really free-form ways, but then the form and the subject are too chaotic together. And so it needed like the kind of cage of the sonnet to push back against what felt at the time just uncontrollable kind of horror that was happening at home.
Are sonnet sequences such as, well, pretty obviously Shakespeare's part of your digestion, your poetic digestion?
Yeah, and in fact, I wrote an introduction for a new edition of Shakespeare's sonnets last year for vintage.
Oh, fantastic! Oh, right. I've just read a novel that's all about somebody reading Shakespeare's sonnets. So
nice.
They're still very alive in the culture. Yeah, it's a debut novel called Practice, and I can't remember who.
I must check that out.
I want to say Rosalind Brown, but I might have that wrong. I'll send you the details. But very interesting debut novel. Okay, I'm going to go to my questions. So, favorite artwork?
You know what? I wrestled with this for so long because it's one of those things where I think it would change every single time I thought. But I took artwork to be a very broad question, and so I thought of a film. And I thought of an Italian film called The Great Beauty, which is just
Grande Bellezza. Yeah.
Just to a desert island, which I could watch again and again because nothing happens in it. But it's just
set in Rome, isn't it?
It's Rome, and it's about Giuseppe Gambardella, a kind of writer who has just turned 60, and he published one great kind of novella 30 years ago and has kind of somehow lived this extraordinary life since, but has never written anything because he was always looking for the great beauty. He was always trying to kind of find this next great subject. And it's just him kind of walking around Rome, having encounters and kind of seeing just a ordinary life, but also the kind of life of privilege that his friends have and how they're kind of all locked in it. But it's just almost the way it's shot and the kind of music of it as well. I remember I went to see it years ago when it first came out, and I was so moved by it, I broke up straight away with my then boyfriend because I thought I can't live in a world where the beauty of this film exists and I'm with this person who I'm not right for, because it was so moving, that film, and so beautiful. And every time I watch it, I'm just reminded of how beautiful it is. And it's got one of the songs is the Beatitudes by the Kronos Quartet. That's the kind of soundtrack that plays as kind of walking around. So a very pretentious thing I like to do when I'm in a new city is play that in my ears and kind of wander around looking at things and, pretending I'm in that movie.
What a wonderful way of describing how art can, it's that Rilke thing. You must change your life.
Change your life.
You can't go on the way that you've been going on. Brilliant. Okay, I'm calling it Book of Shame, but, there is no shame, really. Is there a book that, a novel, a work that you haven't got round to reading that's you maybe should have done by now?
I mean, so many. But all the great Russian literature, I've not read any of. And I think that, especially now I'm kind of thinking much more about elongation in the kind of novel form and what it means to write that. So all great works of Russian literature are my huge kind of blind spot, basically.
Wow. Yeah. Certainly, very different from Pity. They're kind of maximalist, aren't they? They're kind
of... But if I start now, I could slowly work my way through them before the end of time, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just pick, say, Dostoevsky.
Yeah, that'll be easy.
Yeah. I mean, I did it once. I have read all of them. It didn't take too long. I just got quite obsessed. But they were quite old translations, and I think newer translations are probably what you want to go for, not something, But yeah, it's doable. It's doable. Don't be put off.
I'll add it to the
that would be my tip.
Proofs behind me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's always too much to read. But it is good to go back to classics. I mean, I just spend all my time reading contemporary stuff. And every so often you need a reset.
Because you suddenly go, oh, this is how good it could be. Every so often I go back and read Virginia Woolf or Henry James. Things like, this is what it could be.
Yeah.
And just be reminded of that, I think, is really important.
Exactly. And finally, what is the weirdest, funniest bit of feedback you've ever had on any aspect of your work, really?
So when Physical came out, as you were saying, it was kind of received mostly positively, but it got this one kind of just excoriating review online that, in fact, I ended up having put onto a mug. So here it is, phrases from it. And we shouldn't say who wrote the review, Alan Dent, but it says... at one point he said, it will sell well among the homosexual community, but not for the poetry. And I never quite understood what that means, but my colleagues at work gave me it on a lovely pink mug. It's on my shelf just next to the Guardian Awards.
I think that's very good revenge on that. I think maybe everybody should do that. I mean, I remember Simon Armitage coming up to me and quoting a line from a review that I had done years and years and years and years and years before. I don't think he's put it on a mug, but yeah. And he had a twinkle in his eye and a bit of a smile, but how smiley do you really get when a phrase has clearly been tattooed over your heart? Oh wow. Brilliant. So we have been talking about your hot off the press novel Pity, and I hadn't spotted that you always go for the letter P. Is that going to continue, do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to keep doing it right up until just before I die, and then I'm going to choose a different letter, and people will be confounded for it for decades after. Physical was just called Physical because that was just the word. And then I just like the little challenge of it, of going, oh, this is the project, what P word would kind of fit that. And it just it's just genuinely, there's no deeper aesthetic meaning to it other than I just think it's quite funny.
I mean, a question of why have you called it Pity? Because I always call things with the letter P. It's quite a good answer, really, isn't it? So yes, Pity, published by Canongate. I hope the poetry continues to come. And thank you very much for joining me in the book bag, Andrew McMillan. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hope you enjoyed that. Thoroughly recommend this wonderful book. Please like and subscribe if you are able to do so, and join me next time in the book bag for another stimulating author conversation. Thanks very much. Bye.